There's a ton of noise out there. So how do you get decision makers to pay attention to your brand? Start a podcast and invite your ideal clients to be guests on your show. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Hi there, and welcome to the Category Creation Series on the B2B Growth Show. I'm your host, John Ruggi, and I'm the founder of a messaging and positioning consultancy called Flag and Frontier. Now, in our Category Creation Series, we interview marketing and business leaders who have gone through the process of building and designing new categories in their markets. In today's episode, I'm going to talk with Andy Raskin, who helps CEOs align their teams around something called a strategic story. In our conversation, you'll hear about the big aha that Andy had about storytelling after an early startup idea of his was rejected by a VC. You'll also hear why investors look for startup founders who can tell a compelling narrative about their vision. And you'll hear Andy's one subtle but very important tip for crafting a powerful story in business. That and of course a whole lot more. So without further ado, let's hear from Andy Raskin. All right, Andy, thank you for being on the show today. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, great to talk to you, John.
Yeah. So we are here to talk about category design in a broad sense. And we brought you on the show today to talk about storytelling. So in a few minutes, we're going to discuss how those two intersect. But like all my guests, I'd love a little bit more background about yourself and your own story.
Oh, yes. So I work with leadership teams on crafting really the strategic narrative of the company. So aligning the top on what's the story we're telling for sales, marketing, recruiting, product, the whole thing. My own story is that I started doing this. So I was a software developer starting out and so majored in computer science. And a buddy and I had an idea for an app. So we're talking, this is like late 90s. So we're talking Windows app.
Okay, right.
And, .com years. And of the two of us, I spoke English fluently. And so we decided that would qualify me to write the business plan for the company. So I wrote it, we sent it out to a bunch of VCs, and the reaction was really bad. And one of them wrote back to me, Andy, I rate every plan I get on a scale of 1 to 10, and yours is a 1.
Ouch.
And yeah, and then he wrote in parentheses, worst, in case we thought maybe 1 might be the top.
Of all the ones, you were the worst one.
Just to make sure that we didn't have any hope of that his scale went the other way. And so, but then he wrote this other thing. He wrote, not a compelling story. And I didn't pay much attention to it first, but then a few weeks later, I was walking by this Barnes & Noble and I saw this sign in the window and it said, for anyone who wants to tell a compelling story. Literally said that. And I said, okay, that's me. And there's an arrow to these books that turn out to be screenwriting books. And I didn't know anything about that, but I bought these books and read them cover to cover and then rewrote our plan trying to, talk like that and structure it like that. And long story short is things start to change. We start getting invited to pitch, the pitches go better. And within a few months, we have a term sheet, from some pretty good VCs. And, some other things happened too, but it was unmistakable, the kind of interest that we started to get based on how we were telling the story differently. That really was the seed of what I do today. I'll skip a few steps, but basically, eventually other CEOs started hearing about, they knew about the story and they started asking me for help. And sort of by word of mouth, I started getting requests from teams to help them on this piece. And then I wrote that post, The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen. That post has around 2 million views. It breaks down Zuora's strategic story according to the framework that I use in all the engagements I do. And that post has been really popular and has kind of brought this sort of strategic narrative as a thing to think about, I think, more into the mainstream of what people are doing as they're thinking about building their company, how they tell the story, all the rest.
Sure. So you started off as a software developer, not trained or experienced as a marketer. You got very directly rejected by this first VC, heard about the power of story, and then kind of worked your way through these resources on screenwriting and writing scripts, and then you kind of use that to propel your whole career. And I think you mentioned that story started would you say the late 90s? Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So that was 20 some odd years ago. What's interesting is I feel like you've probably got a better perspective on this than I do, but it seems like just recently, like storytelling has become, I don't want to say like a buzzword, but certainly worked its way into the marketing parlance, especially in the B2B space. So why do you think that despite the power of telling a good story, it's only now that we're really starting to talk about it and take it seriously?
Yeah, well, I mean, even back then, you'd hear people talk about it, but it was more in the context of like how to structure your ad, or like that it should, your TV commercial should tell a story. But now you hear, I think it was really starting around 2015, you'd hear like prominent VCs like Bill Gurley talking about how they're looking for the ability of the founders to tell the story as like a criteria for their investment, because they're starting to see that it's not only marketing, but it's also, recruiting, it's fundraising, it's everything. And why is it 2015 does this start happening? I think it has a lot to do with the fact that markets have started getting a lot more crowded. So I saw some research that said that if you start a company now, like in the last couple of years, you're going to have 5 times more competitors coming out of the gate than you would have if you did that 5 or 10 years ago.
You said 5 to 10 times more competitors?
5 to 10 times. And why is that? I think it has a lot to do with, 2015 is right around the time when cloud starts becoming really accessible for founders. So I can, instead of like when we did our startup, we have to buy the computer and, host it somewhere, go visit it when it goes down. Now we can push a button. We got pretty much all the infrastructure, all these coding frameworks make it super fast and easy to go from, idea to feature to product company. And so markets are so crowded. You've probably seen that slide that I think it's Scott Brinker puts out every year called the Marketing Technology Landscape. Just, it's so crowded now that you really can't even see any of the logos anymore.
Yeah, there's like 5,000 companies in like one single page.
He actually calls it the MarTech 5,000, but there are now like something like 7,000 or 8,000 in the MarTech 5,000. So yeah, there's just like no, and so what happened is every market kind of looks like this. That's marketing technology. But I think look at any market, it kind of feels like that to customers. And it means that we reach this new place where the traditional approach to positioning and selling, which is, let me tell you about your problem, let me tell you about the solution I have, and let me tell you why it's better, which is essentially bragging, is no longer going to work because everybody's being hit from all sides by more and more competitors who are bragging. And it gets harder and harder for folks to figure out whose claims hold water. You had, I know, David Cancel on your show recently. David Cancel famously posted on LinkedIn, the era of product differentiation is over. I'm paraphrasing. But I think this is what he meant. That we're not going to be able to win just by sort of saying our product is better, even if it is, because it's very difficult for people to figure it out.
Right. It's so hard to validate which product is better than the other, especially objectively. And as crowded as markets are, that's a really difficult conversation to have and really try to convince your potential buyers of believing in. So when we were talking before we started recording, we were talking about how category design, along with storytelling, is also something that the B2B space is starting to take much more seriously, especially with books like Play Bigger, really bringing that concept to life. And so I know you've read the book, you're familiar with the concept of category design, and one of the core tenets in there is this idea of a point of view of kind of taking the world from a place that used to exist and towards a kind of a new reality. And so there's a story that's needed to make that happen and to help people understand that. So tell me, in your view, like, how do you see storytelling and this idea of category design fitting together?
Yeah. Well, if you think about it, really, what is a category? I think the traditional view, and the view I think most of us have, is it's like a taxonomy of stuff. Like, it's a name for the kind of thing, the kind of animal that we are selling. And what I think the folks who have been really successful at doing this, people like David Cancel at Drift, Tien Tzuo at Zuora, they really see it as something different, which is, it's a taxonomy of discipline. So when David Cancel at Drift is talking about conversational marketing, which is the category that they've really successfully built, he's not so much talking about, hey, Drift is a conversational marketing tool, although of course that's part of it too. At least the way that he's acting and the way others at Drift act is that it's really a kind of new discipline for winning. That this category it's the new winners believe in this new approach and they're getting on this train. This is one issue I have with that Play Bigger approach to the from to. Of course, every story is a from to. Every story is about change. The way I like to think about it is that when we're telling the story, the change has actually already happened.
It's already happened.
It's already happened. It's not something, of course, we are accelerating it. But if you think about, of course, Zuora, one of the great category definition stories, they are talking about the subscription economy. Right back from 2013, when they're early, they're not talking about, hey, we want to create a world in which subscription is the way people enjoy things. They're saying, hey, now people want subscription. That's the new world we're in. And so we're acting, even if we're early, as if this shift has already happened. When I work with teams, we're always talking about it like that. Otherwise, I think it can become very self-centered. Hey, here's how we want to change the world, which can be noble, but it can also be like, it doesn't create urgency because, oh, well, hey, okay, great, go off and change the world. Whereas if the world's already changed, and already you're on the road to ruin if you don't kind of get on this train, then that's urgency.
Wow, it's a subtle point you made, but that makes such a huge difference in how that story comes about. Like when you were talking through that, it reminded me of Segway. Like there was no pre-existing like movement that Segway was taking advantage of or participating in. They were trying to say like, I know nobody's walking on these or using these devices today, but next year everyone's going to be off their feet and using these Segways. And that's totally contrary to the view you've prescribed, which is there's a change that's already taking place, and this company or whatever the service is coming in and equipping you to then deal with and maybe even succeed through that change.
Yeah, and who's to say whether they were just sort of early, just too early in general, whether their story made the difference or not, or could have made the difference, hard to know. But one of the big questions I often get is, hey, our product is not related to a change in the world. Our product isn't related to something that's new, that's changed. It's just something that's better. But actually, so I have a kind of unproven hypothesis that we can create a change story around anything that's new that people actually want. Even if it's just, hey, this is how people are thinking now. People are thinking differently such that they want this new thing. it really is a mind shift about taking it from let's describe our stuff, which is the traditional approach to positioning. Let me describe our stuff, why it's great for you, even though we're talking about about you, like why it's good for you, why it solves your problem, to shifting totally to the starting point anyway, to what's happening in their world, what's happening in the prospect or customer's world that creates the need for this. One of the CEOs I lead a workshop in San Francisco every month, and the CEO of a company called Turing came recently, and I love what he said. He said, we started pitching this way, and now people, we don't even have to tell them what we do. They already know because they've kind of set up the context of what's happening in that person's life. So they kind of know like, oh, okay, you're going to fill this thing in my life. And I love hearing stuff like that.
So tell me a little bit about the process that you use, because I think with storytelling, like really great stories and powerful stories, especially in the context of business, end up being, I guess, fairly succinct. Like you're not doing a 3-hour movie, right? There's power that comes from communicating it in a brief manner, but the process to get there isn't easy or short. So walk me through the process you use to develop these strategic stories.
I really love that you pointed this out because there's a lot of talk actually about, hey, the company story should be kind of structured like a movie. But you're right. We are not building a 3-act screenplay here. We're building something that has to work in all kinds of situations. Some of them where we'll have like just a few words to talk about it. Right. And some of them where, a CEO might be on stage for an hour. And part of the reason I think it took me all that time from when, 20 years ago I had that experience to when I started doing this was figuring out like, what is it? What are the pieces that apply and what don't? And so I lay out these pieces in that post I mentioned about Zuora called The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen. This really is my approach with everyone that I work with, whether it's an individual in the workshop or leadership team of a large startup or even public company in some cases, where we're starting with what is this change in the world that has already happened? And we want to express it in a way that it feels it's undeniably happened. It's not something that we're saying should happen or it's happened or it's happening, and it kind of doubles as this new discipline for winning. It really is the category name if it works well, or kind of clues you into what the category name should be. So Zuora, subscription economy. We now live in a subscription economy, and what are they selling? They're selling subscription billing platform software. So it's about that, right? In order to create the urgency, the next step is how is this change already creating winners and losers? Mm-hmm. And this is so important. We actually talked early. We talked before we started recording about This American Life because I once produced a little piece on there. And one of the things I learned from Ira Glass, the host of that show, who's I think like the world's greatest storytelling master, certainly one of them, is that there's a lot of things that feel like great stories, but what they're missing is stakes. So what's to be won and what's to be lost? And this is the thing I think a lot of company stories miss. We either assume that people know, or there's so many of them that we don't sort of like boil it down. And it's really important to show this. So with Zuora, they show, hey, look at all the companies who are thriving. They're all either subscription or what they'll later started calling usership companies versus ownership. Instead of selling you something like a car, they're selling you, the use of that. I then okay, so now hopefully we have people's attention. The next piece is what I call teasing the promised land. So in order to thrive in this new world, what do we have to get to? Like, what's a very simple articulation of the goal state? With Zuora, they said, hey, now you have to deliver the subscription experience. This was a term they created. They had the subscription experience had some components to it. Airbnb says live there. Live there is some people, it sounds like just a tagline. And of course it doubles as what some people might call a tagline. Yeah. But it does this narrative and strategic work too, which is, hey, if the customer can live there, then it's happy life, happy family, all the things. That's the goal state. That's the goal state we're promising them. And it's also functions as a mission statement for everyone in our company. Having people live there, delivering this, having our customers deliver the subscription experience. That's what, in the end, everybody in our company should be working toward.
Mm.
In a way, this teasing the promised land really, to me, is the best way to define the mission statement. The mission statements are often self-centered.
Yeah.
We want to be the blah, blah, blah disruptor of some industry. Promised land is a customer-centric view of what we want to do. And then, of course, if we are in a place where we have time to talk about product, say a sales call or other things, then first we want to talk about what are the obstacles to this promised land. So what are the obstacles to delivering this subscription experience? What are the obstacles to having people live there? Because of course, if there aren't any, then why do you exist? They could just walk to that promised land. So there must be some big ones. And then now, when we can introduce capabilities and features, but all in the context of overcoming these obstacles. And then finally, some evidence that we can really make this story come true. Of course, the best kind of evidence is stories about other, customers like the person we're talking to who are already we got to the promised land or on their way.
Yeah. It's so interesting how, product marketing, of course, that's an important function in many organizations. But in terms of the order of operations, you mentioned it last in the sequence. So I'll just recap it just for some context. So you talked about, in a very broad sense, where is the world already heading? What's an undeniable change that exists, independent of me or you or our company? Who are the winners and who are the losers, and what are the stakes that the companies face with this change? And then you talked about kind of teasing out the promised land, identifying some obstacles to reaching there, adding some context through the product itself, and then finally talking through like the product's features, and specs and all the kind of weeds of what the company actually does. And I love that because so often you hear companies talk about product first. Even now, like it's all about the speeds and feeds or the features or comparison lists of who has more boxes to tick versus a competitor, right. And that has its place in certain situations, but it sounds like you're saying you've got to walk people through that narrative around what's happening in the world at large first, and then you can talk about how your specific solution kind of plays into that.
Exactly, and so one of the things I see sometimes people do is they'll kind of craft the top stuff, mm-hmm. and then just sort of bolt on the way they always would have talked about their product. Mm. And in order for this to work, it only works if the way if every capability or feature you're talking about is talked about in the context of how it gets over an obstacle to the promised land. Otherwise, it's not relevant to this story.
Right. It's just a feature that doesn't really have like a connection back to the core narrative.
Exactly. Yeah. And so if you just start with those features, then it's not really clear why they matter. And this is about setting up the why they matter context first, and then having them feed into that.
Yeah. So I know, at least for me, when I think about storytelling, I tend to view that as mainly a marketing function. But I know when you talk about your offering and how you work with companies, you don't mention marketers. You talk about working with CEOs, you call them out specifically, and then you talk about working with leadership teams. And so tell me why story isn't just a marketing function or something that only marketers should care about. Why is it something that company at large really needs to be involved in?
Yeah, so this is something that I think I've learned over time. So I actually wrote a post a couple of years ago, why story is the CEO's job. I'll send it to you. Maybe we do a link to it at some point. But what I found was that if the ownership of the story is in marketing, then it's kind of going nowhere. Like there's so many other parts of the company that will rely on this story. So sales, obviously, anyone in B2B world is familiar with the dynamic of marketing kind of creating some story and then pushing it on to sales and, knowing how that goes, not good. Of course, in recruiting, what is this story? Product, we were just talking about product features that they're going to have to overcome obstacles to this promised land. Well, that promised land better be clear. And what is this story? That better be clear for that to be the case. And what I found was that it only worked on all of those levels if the CEO was owning the authorship of it. I realize that this is still relatively an unpopular opinion. And I can't tell you how many projects I've said no to because the CEO wasn't going to lead it and wasn't up for doing this work. But I've just learned like this is so important. The CEO, I think, first of all, is the person who has the sees everything and often has experience, and often, especially early on, they're the person who really has been doing all the sales.
Sure.
And so they have a sense of how the story should be told, how it would work. Often we'll get to a place with the team where there's conflicts about, we think the story should be this, we think it should be this. Marketing usually does not have the authority to align, whereas the CEO does. So I really see the story. My core belief goes back to a quote from Ben Horowitz of Andreessen Horowitz, which is that if you don't have a well thought out, clear story, you don't have a well thought out, clear strategy. That the company story is the company strategy.
The story is the strategy.
The story is the strategy. And if that's the case, well, that's CEO work.
Right. So what do you say then? It sounds like in some situations you just say, hey, we're not a good fit, and you don't engage in those projects. But what do you say, like when you come across someone and you need to convince them of the value of story? Maybe you've already engaged with a client and someone on the leadership team is just being that guy. And for whatever reason, they probably have valid reasons, but it's just not clicking for them. But you need to get their buy-in. How do you tackle that?
I never try to tackle it. I just say, okay, that's like trying to convince someone of that is probably not a good use of my time. And by the way, I don't want to be dissing marketing because marketing has a huge role to play here. I do think the CEO has to own the authorship, but marketing is what I'd call the storytelling center of excellence in most companies still. So marketing is going to be the one that's going to be telling this story the most. Well, I still think the CEO probably should be telling it the most, but in the most channels, the most sort of day-to-day, marketing is going to be doing this. And so marketing is, of course, a huge role to play here. What will sometimes happen is like a head of marketing will contact me and say, hey, our CEO is just not into he's a very technical person, or she is not a person who is more worried about other stuff. How can I convince them? And so I never try. The one thing I sometimes say is, hey, maybe send them whatever kind of got you into this, which often it's that article, The Greatest Sales Deck I've Ever Seen about Deborah. Why don't you send that to them and see if it resonates with them? And there have been some cases where it has. And then the CEO kind of will come on board, and we've gone that way. But I would say it's probably a minority of cases by far. Like I said, it's an unpopular view of this. What I've been lucky enough to find is that there's still enough CEOs who see it this way that this has been able to be a really rewarding career for me.
Yeah. So when you say unpopular, you mean that the majority of CEOs, maybe not the majority, but at least not enough, in your view, understand and recognize this way of talking about the company. Did I get that right?
Enough for me, but I would say probably more CEOs than believe that or see the story as a marketing function.
Yeah.
And not something that they have to own and define to this degree of detail.
Right.
Then believe that.
Do you think that's okay? Like if they empower their head of marketing to really own that and kind of back them in their decisions? Like if they're like, okay, look, this sounds, I get it, but it's not going to click for me. I'm not going to be an evangelist and I'm not going to be involved, but I'll, equip the head of marketing to really do what they need to do. Or is that really just setting them up for failure?
I don't know. I mean, maybe there's some companies where it works that way and it works fine. It's hard for me to know. It just does seem to me like, the CEO is the chief story person. Like, David Cancel, great example. I mean, I was doing a podcast with Dave Gerhardt recently where we talked about some of these similar things, and Dave's podcast is called Marketing Swipe File, and he was like, hey, I want to talk about how marketers can do this, and I said, Dave, you're just like so lucky because you have a CEO who totally sees this story as his job. That, of course, Dave plays this huge role also there too in telling the story and advancing it and all the rest. But Dave, sees this as part of his leadership. And it's just hard for me to imagine a CEO who is, out there doing all the things that a CEO needs to do, who does not totally own this story from the beginning.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're right. Like that, they're in a good position because right at the very top, their leadership understands the importance of branding, the importance of story, and then he's equipping his team to invest in that. And without that, it's very much an uphill battle. In marketing, we talk a lot about testing things, doing market research, getting the reaction of customers. Is it something you can test? Do you test it, or is it more of an internal exercise?
Yeah, so I would say yes and no, depending on what we mean by test. So, to some degree, we always test it, of course. So I've been on the receiving end of a lot of positioning work in my career.
Mm-hmm.
And often it would come in the form of, I don't know, like a positioning statement or like category name and, sort of category statement. Basically, these are things that customers never see.
Yeah.
And so the idea is like, this is some sort of like foundational thinking, and then we're going to then go build out things based on this. What I decided early on was that never worked for me. Well, before I decided something, I realized like that in all the companies I was at, like we build these positioning statements and things. And then when it came time to like build the sales deck, to build a website, do a CEO keynote, it was like starting from scratch again.
Mm.
And that I think is because these things are not narrative assets. They're just sort of like this descriptive stuff. So I decided to go straight to something that's narrative and that customers see. And I chose the sales deck as the thing to use as the instrument of building and testing the narrative. And so with all the team, and partly that's, I work with strictly B2B teams. And so that we build the narrative through the sales deck. Because the sales deck has all the pieces, we can talk about this change, the promised land, and the features, all the rest. We can take it out in sales calls and say, hey, are we getting interest? Are we getting energy from this? Where are we not? And we're working on it and tweaking it. And so in all my engagements, we're not done until we've actually taken it out in sales calls for some number of weeks and gotten a sense that it's working. And that has a whole bunch of benefits. One is we get over that problem of marketing is pushing something on sales. Sales is the place we're starting. And then if that is working, then we're having marketing and everyone else jump on board and tell that same story. Also, we're doing a little bit of testing. We're getting a sense that it's working. We're tweaking it. But of course, this is not A/B testing.
Right.
I think there is something about the strategic narrative that we're building that is kind of coming from the leader as a choice of strategic direction that is not really subject to A/B testing. We can A/B test assets that come out of it. So we build this sales deck, and let's say we build a website that's based on the messaging of the sales deck, which is what we do. So if we do it right, the sales deck messaging actually guides the website messaging. Are we getting people to click in this place? And that's a different level of test. So my answer, yes, we test it always, but really we're testing it for kind of high level. Are we getting interest? Are we getting the nods that we're looking for when people are hearing the story?
Right. But that core strategy, I'm not sure you can really test that. It doesn't sound like you really should, because that's like the essence of what the company is and represents, and you can't just flip back and forth between different strategies arbitrarily.
Right. And especially, we're calling it the story. Really, we could be calling it the category, because in my opinion, really it is the same thing. The category really is a new story. Conversational marketing is a new story. Subscription, it's a new story.
Yeah.
And those things are, by definition new, and we may encounter some resistance to it and almost expected. And so if we sort of bring it back to where everyone agrees with it, then we're losing some of the engine that is going to power the category creation, the company's success.
Yeah. I love that thought, Andy, because it ties back to what you mentioned earlier at the beginning of our conversation about how many people view category as this taxonomy of like business offerings. And sometimes that's an outcome, but I love the way that you put that. I think you said a category is a new story. And I think that describes it. It's beautiful the way that like ties it all together. So yeah, I love that. Who else do you think is doing category and storytelling really well right now?
Really, the folks that I mentioned, I think David Cancel and David Gerhardt at Drift have just been incredible. I write probably too much about them. They have this core narrative, and then they just tell it in like so many different ways through so many different channels in this, of course, authentic way. That's just really fantastic. Zuora, was one of the great category stories. By the way, the Zuora story was created by a woman named Judy Lohr. At least she had a large hand in it when she was VP of marketing there early on. And Judy came from Salesforce, which was, of course, maybe the modern era's greatest category creation story of this cloud. And if you look back to what Benioff is doing, there's a direct line of that from that to what Zuora is doing to Drift and others.
Sure. All right, good stuff, Andy. I love all of the high level thoughts, all the strategy, all the stories you've shared today. What are, just to kind of cap things off, what are some of your go-to resources? I know you've got a lot of your great content yourself that you've written, which I want to provide links to in the notes because there's some real gems there. In terms of what you've read elsewhere, books, authors, thought leaders, who are your go-to resources for storytelling?
Yeah, so this is going to sound like a strange one because it sounds unrelated, but there's a negotiation book called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss.
Yeah.
You know this book?
Yeah, great read.
Yeah. So that book is not positioned as a storytelling book.
Yeah.
Or anything like, it's positioned as a negotiation book. But actually, to me, it is a storytelling book. What he's talking about is he's talking about switching negotiation to be about creating empathy. And how do you create empathy? You essentially tell the other person's story. He has this great line about how he looked over the years at, was there a pattern in what was making his hostage negotiations most successful? Like, when did they turn from where this captor is having like ridiculous demands to like they're doing a deal where maybe they get nothing and maybe have to go to jail?
Right.
And it was always when the negotiator would say their own the captor's story back to them. So, hey, so it sounds like you want this amount of money. Otherwise you're gonna do this horrible thing. And this is because your cause is being disrespected in all these ways, X, Y, and Z. And finally, the person would say, "That's right," after maybe a bunch of times trying this. And this "that's right" was like the key thing. Basically saying, yes, you told my story. And I think what we've talked about today in structuring the story, that the pitch this way for the category of company, it's a similar dynamic. We're trying to, if product differentiation is dead, the meaning we can't differentiate and win by bragging our product is better. How can we do it? We can do it by being the one who tells their story the clearest and gets them to say, yes, they understand me, I trust them. And so anyway, Never Split the Difference by Christopher Voss, probably my favorite book for my own business and for giving context about how I work with other companies as well.
Yeah. I'm glad you pointed out those key words because I think he talks about the difference between someone saying yes and someone saying that's right. And when they say that's right, it's a sign of empathy that they feel like you understand them. But if they're saying yes, it means that it's almost like you have informed them of something and they're acknowledging that they understand it, but there's not that empathetic connection that happens there.
Totally. That's right.
All right. Good stuff, Andy. Well, if one of our listeners wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
My website is andyraskin.com. LinkedIn is also a great place. I will often meeting lots of new folks on LinkedIn, so that's a great place to connect with me. And if you happen to be so I work with venture-backed teams with the leadership team on getting the story straight. But for individuals or early stage founders, others who are interested in this stuff, I also lead a workshop in San Francisco every month at General Assembly, and you can find times on my website as well for that.
Okay, and that's andyraskin.com.
Yeah.
All right, Andy, it was a real pleasure talking to you today. I learned a ton from you, so thank you so much for taking the time to be with me.
Cool, thanks. It's really cool to be able to talk about this stuff in the whole context of categories and all the stuff you're working on. So thanks.
Yeah, my pleasure. Take care. Okay, well, that wraps up our conversation with Andy Raskin. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that this episode made you, in some small way, a better storyteller. If you have questions about this episode, about category creation, or just want to recommend a guest, you can reach me at john@flagandfrontier.com. That's JOHN @flagandfrontier.com. Or, of course, you can look for me on LinkedIn. Thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.